Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of a bookish trip.
Hello, I'm Kari Trumbo, and I'm one of the authors of the Independence Island series. We're talking about Merriweather Island. My particular book is Secret Beach Boyfriend, and it's about Annie Roman, who is very scared of any type of personal relationship with men because her father left her. And then there's Rafe, who's dealing with the breakup of his family. And so the way that these two work together to kind of help themselves along is very fun and interesting, and it's a little bit more tropey than I'm used to writing, but it's also deep, so I hope you really enjoy it, and I'm going to read the first chapter for you. All that rushing around looked very little like relaxing. Annie Roman squinted into the bright setting sun to the ferry pulling into the dock. The bustling ship, packed with vacationers and islanders, seemed to approach at a snail's crawl from her safe little booth on the shore. A stiff breeze blew in off the Atlantic, and she held onto her floppy straw hat as the ferry pulled in, preparing to dock on Mimosa Island, the same as it did every day, bringing islanders and vacationers alike to the Independence Island chain. Even from the protection of her booth, the wind threatened to whip her hat away. A businessman in a narrow-cut, slate-gray suit caught her eye as he adjusted his tie on the way toward her booth. Men like him were unusual on the islands. He strode toward her with his head stuck in his phone, his thumbs moving at breakneck speed. That was different. Since people needed to work long hours for jobs requiring suits, islanders typically didn't take those positions. Vacationers didn't don suits to head to the island. It was over an hour ride by ferry to the mainland, not optimal if someone had to work longer than 8 hours a day. He'd almost reached her booth when a family of 8 jostled in ahead of him like a motorboat blasting into a slip. Mom looked to have already been in the sun a few hours too long. Her hair hung clumped together in sections around her damp face, and her forehead resembled the inside of a watermelon. "Where we go to find the hotel?" The woman was laden with suitcases seemingly attached to her by the force of nature alone. Her clothing pulled where all the luggage dug at her shoulders and arms. Her sunglasses had to have been sat upon at some point. Which hotel, miss? Ma'am?" She shrugged and leaned against the booth. Annie always tried to be nice, but there were many places for vacationers to stay on the large island. Most Independence Islanders worked on Mimosa in those parks, attractions, and hotels. The woman sighed loudly, and one of her children screamed, "Ice cream!" as she dashed into the crowd toward a street vendor's cart. Annie had long since tuned out the crank music box sound of the ice cream man. The woman's husband dropped all the bags he'd been lugging and gave chase as she pointed to one of the other children to stand guard over the bags, giving him one of those threatening mom looks that Annie recognized immediately as harried traveling mom. The man in the suit moved forward. "Excuse me, I'm in a little bit of a hurry. I need to get to Merriweather Island, and I can't find a schedule, not even online. I can't remember which ferry is the one that takes the long way around the islands, and which is the direct route." Annie wanted to answer him. It would only take a moment, and he had been there first. As she opened her mouth, the mother shuffled him to the side and yanked the brochure out of her gargantuan flamingo-colored purse. "This one, right here." She pointed with a threatening staccato to a red X on a map of the island, like a treasure map. There were no street names and few landmarks other than scattered tourist traps. Instead of looking at the map, she searched the corners of the page for a logo. It looked like a brochure a hotel might give out as a draw for customers. She bit her lip and tried to think clearly. Though she worked the ferry booth, she wasn't well versed on where everything was on Mimosa, especially under pressure. The line behind the suited man lengthened as she tried to figure out where to send the woman. "I think you go down this street and take a third right. That's what it looks like on the map." The woman rolled her eyes. "Listen here, miss, I don't care about the tourist. I could have figured that out on my own." She stomped away. "Just another reason why we don't need tourism on the other islands." "You're welcome," Annie mumbled. The man in the suit frowned as the ferry he probably should have stayed on pulled away. "Can you help me now?" He'd put his phone away, and he held a small shoulder bag in one hand. His sunglasses were designer, but he didn't have an attitude like she'd expected based on what he wore. What she could see of his face was handsome and tanned. He didn't move, smile, or remove his sunglasses as he stepped closer to her booth. "I'm sorry. I hope you aren't in too much," she tried to answer as another eager tourist shoved forward. "Excuse me." An old man in a Hawaiian print shirt slapped his hands down on her counter. This part of the job always made her uncomfortable. She had to try to make both people happy, yet how could she? "I was helping this gentleman, But I need to know right now, is there a tour of the lighthouse on Breaker's Head? How do we even get to the other islands? Swim? I've gone up and down the coast, and I can see the other island from here, but I can't find a way to get to it. He crossed his arms and glared at her as if he was accusing her of personally hiding the secret. She was used to people treating her like she wasn't really a person. Just an information booth. No more feelings than Google. Today was no different than any other. This job was the reason she lived in a tiny cottage by the shore on the far side of Meriwether Island, where she couldn't even see another island. She bit her tongue to keep from saying what she'd like to. Mr. Suit laid his hands on the counter of her booth and stared at the older man. There are no tours available on any of the other islands. Probably never will. You're free to swim if you'd like, but you won't find much on the other islands besides beaches. Just warn the Coast Guard before you do. Now, I've been waiting. Can I please talk to... He glanced at her, and his eye caught for just a moment on the silly pirate map name tag with a giant X that her boss insisted she wear. Annie here, please? The older man stalked off, and though his mouth moved, she couldn't hear anything he said over the wind. Mr. Suit had to have come from the islands, or at least be familiar if he knew none of the rest had any offerings for tourists. But she didn't recognize him, which was strange, since she'd lived there her whole life. There was no way he could have guessed about the other islands. Who'd ever heard of islands without tourism? But that's exactly what her parents had always loved about this particular archipelago. Mimosa was their offering to the world, the place anyone was welcome. The other islands were God's gift to the people who inhabited them. You're an islander, or perhaps a relative of an islander. He finally took off his sunglasses, but it didn't help. She still didn't recognize him. His hair was too caramel to be blonde, and too light to be brown. When he smiled, he had those long dimples that framed his whole lips. Not for a decade. So long I don't remember my way around anymore. I hope I didn't steer him wrong. My parents never told me the association changed the rules. I would think they would have said something. He set down his bag and shoved his hands in his pockets. Standing like that, with the sun shining on his face and the ocean in the background, he looked like a model for men's suit. People behind him started thinning out as they actually took out maps of the island. She was at a loss for words. He was nothing like any other islander. Nope, still no tourism anywhere but Mimosa. You said you wanted to go to Meriwether? That was her island. While it wasn't so small as Hopper or Sparrow, it was enough that she thought she knew everyone there. Rafe Tedfield, he smiled, and yes, Meriwether. She knew the Tedfields, and she knew they had a son who was a few years older than her. But since she'd been homeschooled, she missed a generation. She knew people older than her who were her parents' friends and younger, but few cohorts, especially the male ones. The next boat that would take him would be the same one she would be taking home. He could have stayed on the main ferry and made it, but it tended to lumber along. There always seemed to be people hopping from island to island, willing to give rides, not to mention the bridges between most islands, but there was no bridge from Mimosa. The afternoon ferry leaves in about an hour from that dock. Curiosity got the better of her because the Tedfields were her Bible study partners, and she would be meeting with them later tonight. Markingale didn't mention you'd be coming. They hadn't mentioned much of anything lately, with all the bickering. His facade of indifference cracked for a moment, and his forehead rippled with worry lines. My visit is more of a surprise. One of many, I hope. He smiled, slipped his sunglasses back on, and nodded in thanks as he strode off into the crowd. That floppy hat was unmistakable. From Rafe's position seated at the rail of the ferry, he could see just about everyone, including the woman from the ferry ticket booth. Annie had been her name. The hat was smart. He'd forgotten how the sun beat down on the boat like the ocean was glass. His suit would need to go to the cleaners when he got back to Savannah. Annie had said she knew his parents, which meant she'd probably seen the trouble brewing between them. His phone buzzed, and he slipped the device from his pocket. The text from his mother was short and to the point. I'm finished with this. I can't take it anymore. His heart clenched. He couldn't be this close to home and have her walk out. Not now. He'd come as quickly as he could. Getting time off wasn't easy when he was the finance department of the dealership where he worked. He never took time off. His fingers flew over the screen. Just hold on, Mom. We'll talk soon. Don't do anything yet. If he told her he was within a mile of her, she'd freak and try to clean the whole house in 20 minutes. His mom had always suffered from minor OCD, which was part of the issue. Growing up, it had been manageable. He just kept his friends and everyone else away from the house, because in a disturbance in Mom's schedule could trigger a few weeks of stress for her. His dad had mentioned over the last few months that she was getting more sensitive, and he didn't know how to deal with it. No matter how he tried, it was always wrong. The OCD seemed to ebb and flow like the tide, but Dad would never see it coming. What they needed was counseling, and a miracle. That's why Rafe had told his boss he was finally taking time off so he could be there. His boss hadn't been pleased, but he couldn't do much. Rafe hadn't taken a vacation day in years, and who else his age didn't even take a mental health day? He'd built a huge amount of trust with the owner of the dealership. Taking too long on the island could jeopardize his whole career. There wouldn't be time to get to know the woman from the ferry booth, no matter how enjoyable that might be. Annie sat huddled with her back to the wind, her nose buried in a book. The bag at her feet was plain brown paper with sturdy handles that read "The Book Barrow" in scrolling letters. She was the only person on the ferry even close to his age, and everyone else seemed to ignore her. So many people on the islands were older or retired. He assumed all his friends had left, just as he had, to find jobs on the mainland. That had been their plan at graduation, though he'd call later to find out. He loved Merryweather, but it just didn't have everything he needed, like a midnight taco once in a while. The ferry pulled into the slip by Pirates Cove, and after it docked, they dropped the apron. Annie seemed to sense where they were, and she carefully put her bookmark in and dropped the book in her bag. He stayed back a good distance. No sense in making her think he was following her. The island was small enough that she'd probably think he was anyway. He let a few older residents off before him. They nodded his way but didn't speak. If they knew who he was, they probably thought it was well past time for him to come home and help his family. Of course, he could just be projecting. He'd been known to do that, too. The whole island seemed to now know about his mother's issue, whereas they'd kept it private when he was young. From what he'd gathered from his father's texts, they'd been to a Bible study, and the leader had tried to give them counsel. It wasn't helping. He waited his turn, then disembarked. The tangy smell of beach hit him first. Then he let sensory history sink in for just a minute. He didn't have much time, but he hadn't been on the island in a decade. His parents had always come to visit him for holidays, and he hadn't made coming back a priority. A row of older, colorless buildings was all he could see of Merryweather proper. Even 10 years before, the downtown had people. Now there were no cars parked along the street, nor people walking down the sidewalk. Only people making their way to a small parking area down along the port. He'd have to brew his own coffee in the morning, if his mom let him get the coffee pot dirty. A large truck rumbled into the parking area and stopped. He couldn't read the side of it from where he stood, but people immediately changed directions and headed for the truck. A dark-haired woman climbed down and headed for the back. Within minutes, the side of the truck was open and taking orders. He smiled at the people waiting for the convenience food. He'd never wanted the islanders to give up their independence, but it was nice to see people trying to make this lifestyle work for everyone. He breathed in deeply and listened to the gulls call as he made his way up the slight incline past the cove. A couple people stared at him, but they didn't say a word. He wasn't dressed for the occasion, and 10 years changed a person a lot, especially if those 10 years started on graduation day. He loosened his tie until it hung loosely around his neck and fought the urge to yank his phone from his pocket to check the time. A quick scan of the area, and he realized he'd lost Annie. He'd hoped to at least wave before she drove off, since she'd known he was coming to Merryweather. At least he'd see her again when he headed back to work in a few days. Hopefully that was all it took to get his parents back on speaking terms. Mom and Dad's Bible study was supposed to be that evening, but if they were fighting, they might not go. That would give him time to talk sense into them that very night. He couldn't remember when the study started exactly, but he'd have to catch them before they left, just in case. He chuckled as he strode along in the setting sun. He was on island time now. The study would start when everyone arrived. That was just the way of things. Once he'd reached the top of the slope leading up to town, he veered right and headed down the road toward home. A tiny two-seater car that was small enough to park sideways pulled to a stop alongside him. Annie waved from the driver's seat. The window slowly slid down. "Hey, I know the way, and it's a long walk, especially in a suit. Want to ride? I've got air conditioning." She laughed, looking more at ease now than she had in her booth. He tugged on his collar as sweat trickled down his back. He could walk, but a ride would be much easier, and that AC was more than welcome. Plus, if a pretty woman asked him for a ride, who was he to say no? He nodded, and she popped open the trunk from her spot on the driver's seat. He laughed as he realized that trunk wouldn't even fit 4 bags of groceries comfortably. Luckily, he hadn't packed much. He shut the trunk and got in next to her, already more comfortable as a blast of cool air hit him. "Where'd you get this little ride?" "Not on the islands. Even Mimosa didn't have a dealership. I ordered it online. You can get just about anything these days. The dealership sent a man over, and I signed my life away. I needed a car that was smaller than my house." She laughed nervously. "Smaller?" He glanced behind him at the rear window and held in a laugh. The car was so small, if he was any taller, he wouldn't fit. And he wasn't a big guy. As they took the road that circled the island, he took a moment to really look at Annie. She had dark golden hair with a slight wave to it. Her face was natural, without any makeup. she was the kind of girl he would have hung out with before he'd decided his career was more important than marriage. The kind who could be distracting. But maybe he would need something positive if his parents proved to be a more difficult project than he thought. The gravel road led them along the east side of the island, and finally to the southeasternmost point, where there was more sand and scattered homes than anything else. A white two-story house sat on a man-made rise about 50 yards from the sandy shore. The house where he'd grown up hadn't changed a bit. He'd love to climb down the high rock wall to get to the water when he knew he'd have enough time to clean up before Mom would see him. The house wasn't large, but looked like a small white barn from the outside. There was a two-level deck off the ocean side of the house. The upper one was from his parents' room, the lower led into the living room. When he was growing up, they'd repainted the outside every 5 years because wind and storm rain would chip away the paint fast. It looked like it needed to be done. Probably one more task that was irritating Mom. "I'm sure I'll see you around," Annie clutched the steering wheel and bit her lip like she wanted to say more. He knew just what she was thinking, even without knowing her. She would want to inform him what he was walking into, in case he didn't realize. "I'm sure you will. Thanks for the ride." He hated to run, but that look of mixed worry and pity sat in his stomach wrong. While he'd like to enlist Annie's help in remaining sane while he was on the island, pity was the last thing he wanted to see on her face. She popped the trunk once more, and he grabbed his bag before he strode up to the front door and opened it. He hadn't worn them, but he wasn't prepared for the organized chaos in front of him. Huge stacks of newspapers lined the kitchen walls, but all of them in perfect order like they'd come right off a printer and landed there. Clean pans sat nested on the kitchen counter like they'd been pulled right from a box. 6 sets of various-sized kitchen storage containers stood like soldiers flanking the entire kitchen counter from largest to smallest and back again, creating a cream ceramic wave. All strange, considering his mother had never even allowed a microwave on her kitchen counter, nor was Dad allowed a newspaper subscription because of the mess. "Mom?" Rafe cleared his throat and leaned to look through the pass-through window to the living room. There was no answer, and he gave up the act and tugged his phone from his pocket. It was just after 6. He was sure his parents didn't have to be at their study until 7 or so. "Dad?" He heard the living room screen door close and peered down the hall. His father, Mark, tapped one foot against the other to get the sand off, and Rafe flinched, glancing down at his feet. He'd forgotten to remove his shoes. "Rafe!" His father strode in with arms wide. "I'm so glad you're here. It's good to see you. This is so unexpected." He didn't miss the worried glance his father gave the whole kitchen. He wished the deep lines of stress across his father's face actually conveyed the message of welcome. "It sounds like you and Mom could use some help. I came as quickly as I could. And maybe Mom more than he thought." "What's going on?" He gestured to the room at large. He still couldn't believe what he was seeing. Dad led him to the table, and they sat. "Mom's outside. The waves. They're constant, you know. They help her to calm down when something happens. Problem is, things that never bothered her before suddenly do. I'm at my wit's end." He bowed his head and rubbed his forehead. "I don't know what to do when the Lord says no. All my life, I had faith that if you asked for things that would seem to help the kingdom and the people around you, that he would see fit to bless you." Rafe straightened his spine and pursed his lips. God was God, and he'd do what he wanted. Over the years, planning was the only way to ensure success. What Mom needed was an intervention of both support and help. Where prayer obviously hadn't succeeded, work would. "I'm here for a few weeks to help, both with Mom's OCD and getting you two back on the same page." Dad shook his head, and the lines on his brow deepened as he craned his neck to glance back over his shoulder. "I think that sun has set, son."